Thanks for the question. The first thing is in New York City, Rikers Island has to remain open. Recidivism is a huge problem. And, as long as you have a violent environment in our prison system, releasing convicts back into the society is moronic. It's the same as voting for Democrats and expecting a different result. What we need to do is eliminate or greatly reduce the violence that occurs inside our prisons, address mental illness, and provide inmates the life skills they may have missed early on in life before they became incarcerated. The first thing I would do is ensure that prisons provide proper correction officer to inmate ratio that's greater than the actual inmates that they're required to supervise. In that way, you can quell violence as soon as it starts, and there's less injury actually to the inmate population and the correction officers that have to supervise them. When you don't have that ratio like that, and you don't have that show of force, the inmates run the prison, and they know they can inflict violence. So basically, the guards are on their tour of 12 hours or whatever it is, and they're going to do whatever they can to keep the peace, which is basically do what the inmates say do, which means turn a blind eye when other inmates are victimized. That's not the way to run a prison. The other thing is, not everyone can be reformed, but no one can be reformed when they're having violence perpetrated on them, because they're going to, it's just a vicious cycle, and they're going to succumb to being the perpetrators of violence and joining gangs to prevent themselves from being victims. Many inmates and criminals suffer from mental illness as well, and they're victim to the mob rule that's pervasive throughout prison. So we got to eliminate that. We need a process that triages for mental illness, and we need special facilities where you have specially trained corrections officers so that they can treat the inmate population as well. Finally, release from prison should be contingent upon successful completion of training programs that provide life skills, so that when you introduce somebody back into society, they're not without skill so that they can't get a decent job. Now, I'm not saying that you provide them a college education and they should come out of prison ahead of the guy that never committed a crime. But obviously, you have to provide them the life skills. And that may be as simple as reading, writing, and arithmetic, and civics, which I hope we get into later when we discuss education. But, the three things I want to do is stop the violence in prison, address the mental illness, provide them the skills. And you can't do that unless you have the proper inmate guard ratio.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we should empower the parents over the UFT. The current model spends about $22,000 per child, and we graduate illiterate children out of high schools. That's unsustainable. It's ridiculous. It doesn't do society any good. It doesn't prepare these young folks for the jobs that I plan to create. So what I would do is I would take the money from the UFT and the DOE, and I would give the parents their tax dollars back in the form of vouchers. I favor charter schools, vouchers, and homeschooling. The current model also says that you have the learned professional, the DOE, and the UFT, the teachers union, knowing better what's good for your child than you. That's wrong. Nobody knows what's better for my children than me and my wife. So I think we take the power back from them by taking our tax dollars back and giving that to parents. Now, if a parent wants to send their child to public school, then they stay in the public school system. If they don't want to send their child to the public school system, then they should be given a voucher so that they could have charter schools and homeschooling. But we should give them the power to choose how their child is educated. Also, charter schools and homeschooling would create competition. Additionally, the Democrat machine in New York City has created an elaborate bureaucracy that is too sophisticated to be controlled by parents. That's wrong. That's not the way government was designed. I would replace it with a system like those run by smaller municipalities, excuse my French, municipalities, and local school boards in small towns. Each borough should have its own school board, its own local school board, with the people that operate it elected by the citizen parents. And that way, the parents have control. Currently, you have a system where you have appointees, all right, unelected appointees that are controlled by the mayor and the UFT and the BOE, this big conglomerate that's too sophisticated and too large for anybody to wrap their brain around to exercise control. So you break it down into small, manageable chunks, and you give the parents true control. Now, they're going to fight me. The DOE and the UFT is going to fight me tooth and nail. But if I can get this legislation passed, parents will have local control of their child's education, just like parents in many other jurisdictions, and they'll be better for it. They'll also have the ability to take their tax dollars in the form of a voucher and choose where to educate their child. Parents know best. Now, they're going to have this argument that some parents are ill-equipped. I get that. But you don't legislate toward the minority. You legislate toward the majority, and you address the minority issues where you need to. We talked about triage and mental health with prison reform. If you have parents that are incapable of parenting, through an adjudicated process through a court with probable cause to even start the process, and an adjudication where you find that parent unfit, then okay, for the safety of the child, in limited circumstances, the state has to step in. But no more of this government telling us what's best for our children, because really all they do is indoctrinate kids. So that's my plan. It's bold, but it can be done. I think the principles of supply and demand always work. So the thing to do is to move teachers away from Common Core, which basically indoctrinates children against their family and their parents' core values, their religious values, their moral and ethical values. It's an indoctrination program into global socialism. You're going to hear me talk about that a lot because we've been attacked by global socialists, but it's an indoctrination program. As children move away, or as the teachers move away from Common Core and its indoctrination, and they start to actually teach what they were meant to teach, reading, writing, arithmetic, and civics, they'll become more competitive. Their skill set will become more valuable, and you won't need an artificial stimulus like the UFT or some arbitrary board saying that, this is what the value is. Teachers will actually have worth because they'll be given they'll be providing a vital service. And don't get me wrong, I love teachers. I have a lot of friends that are teachers, but right now they're not allowed to teach. They're forced to indoctrinate children based on state guidelines with Common Core, and they're forced to sit there and evaluate kids instead of teaching them. When they start to move away from that, like I said, their skill set will be valued by parents, and with those vouchers, the parents will pick and choose the teachers they want. Parents want children that are well educated, who know their rights, and graduate ready to fill well-paying jobs, the type of jobs that I'm going to produce if my plan is followed. So like I say, this new technology that's out there, teachers can leverage that and move into the system where they directly talk to the parents and the local school boards and provide that needed commodity, which is their ability to impart reading, writing, arithmetic, and civics into the children. None of this indoctrination stuff. That will increase their value tenfold, and parents will be willing to use that voucher. School boards and school systems will be willing to pay that salary, and so teachers aren't going anywhere. But what we need to do is we need to do it smarter, instead of what the Democrat machine that's now run by AOC in Western Queens, instead of what they've given us for the last several decades of indoctrination, we go back to the basics. They work. Short answer is the citizens cannot protect themselves under ridiculous and unconstitutional Democrat gun laws. They just don't work. No criminal has ever obeyed a law. So who are you disarming? You're disarming the honest citizen, right? Democrats have systematically disarmed us in violation of our Second Amendment constitutional rights, while disparaging and defunding the NYPD and just basically maligning the reputation of the brave men and women of law enforcement. This can't stand. And they've created more violence with their open borders nonsense because they're importing more criminality. Gang violence is driving the homicide rate currently. And sadly, civilians are being caught in the crossfire. But this is the thing. Most folks don't realize the police are not obligated to protect them unless they undertake an action which imperils them. There's no inherent, you owe me a duty of protection from the police. So you can't really sue the police if they didn't respond to the 911 call, But the way our country was designed is every citizen had the right to keep and bear arms, and that means walking in the street. People don't want to hear that, but that is the truth. That's the way it was designed, and that is a fundamental right. And again, you don't take away everybody's rights because you have a minority. Criminals really are a minority. Unfortunately, the severity of their actions is so high that it creates drama. And, Democrat socialists want us disarmed because they want more control. The reason for the Second Amendment, it wasn't written in there for hunting and stuff or recreational shooting, although I do all of those things. But it was written in there to give the citizen parity with government. And if you don't have the right to keep and bear arms any way you want, except for somebody else's property, then you don't have parity with government. But once elected, I'll introduce legislation to fund NYPD back to the pre-pandemic levels, all right? To protect, I'll protect qualified immunity for officers in all of law enforcement, and I'll bring NYPD's pay in line with other large police departments. People don't realize that, but our police department is underpaid when you compare them against other large metropolitan areas that are smaller, have a smaller force, have a smaller geographic area to patrol, and that's just unsustainable. So we need to get back what we had. When they defunded the police and they took out the plainclothes unit, they created an inherent situation for violence. Because at some point, hopefully me and the mayor with some common sense gets in, and the police are going to have to take back the streets. But in order to do that, they're going to have a confrontation with the thugs. They've lost valuable intelligence. They've lost their presence, so they don't have a show of force. Criminals are emboldened. They're carrying illegal firearms that are not acquired through a license. And in order to eliminate that, they're going to have to go in those neighborhoods and confront them. So there's going to be violence in the future. And they're going to want to blame the Republicans and conservatives for this, but they created it by emboldening the criminal. Social workers are not going to work. Their current model is to call a social worker. Well, let me tell you, when you got a knife or a gun in your throat, I've been in combat. I know what it is to get shot at. Call that social worker, because I hear they give pretty good counseling to the victims after you're gone and to the criminal perpetrator, but they're not going to do you any good when that person has a knife or a gun in your throat. The other thing I would do is I would require NYPD to issue any law-abiding citizen a concealed carry permit within 30 days of applications. And I don't think that the citizen should be required to pay for a firearms license because it's a direct infringement. They talk about disenfranchising people from voting because they require ID. That's a smart thing to do, to require ID so we don't have election fraud, But when you charge $400 for a pistol permit, you disenfranchise the
minority neighborhoods.
I'm not going to say minorities because they classify me as a minority. I'm an American citizen of African and European descent. I don't really consider myself a minority. However, some people of my pedigree do. But if, poor people on low income people on fixed incomes are disparaged against directly by being required to have a pistol license because they can't afford $450. They can barely afford to put food on the table. I was over at St. Teresa's yesterday, and I was talking to some of the ladies in the food pantry line, and their biggest concern is putting bread on the table. But you know what? They should be able to walk to and from St. Teresa's to their home with the food they got without having to worry about being accosted. And we've had a spike specifically at the Woodside houses in our district, but citywide we've had a spike in homicides, and that's just uncalled for. The last thing I want to talk about on this subject, unless you have more, is that I would lobby the state legislature. We got to get some common sense Republicans in there to repeal New York Safe. It's unconstitutional, and it does anything but make New Yorkers safe. Anytime you want to know what a Democrat piece of legislation does, just look at the name, and it does the exact opposite. New York Safe does the exact opposite. This current federal bill they have for election integrity and all that, it does the exact opposite. Democrats are good at branding, but they lie. They lie. Democrat politicians. There's a lot of decent, good, hard-working Democrat constituents and voters out there, and I want to appeal to them. I need their help and I need their vote, because they have to be tired of the murder and mayhem that this administration and the current city council has created with their defund the police. I mean, police officers were being punched in the face, run over with cars, stabbed, and otherwise assaulted. And if they did anything in response, they were being dragged before courts. You know, we got to stop this assault on the police. It's destroyed their morale, and it's made us all less safe. So we need to bring some law and order back to New York City. And ending qualified immunity means that when an officer goes out and does his or her job, that they're subject to being sued and having their livelihood, their family home, and everything taken away from them. If you want to end any kind of immunity, end the absolute immunity that politicians are given. And I bet you they grow some common sense real quick. Politicians go on a chamber of their particular body and lie through the skin of their teeth because they know they have absolute immunity. Meanwhile, a police officer goes out and tries to do the right thing and protect the citizenry. And maybe they get excited. You know, if you've ever been in a gun battle or if you've ever been in a real fight, Van Bramer loves to talk about we're fighting for this and that. He's probably never been in a real fight in his life. But if you've ever had the adrenaline turned on, trying to protect yourself or somebody else, you can't just turn it down like that. That they want these guys to be robotic. Somebody's just punched you in the face. In the process of taking that person into custody, somebody's going to get scuffed up a bit. You know, You want more training, you want more discipline, but those are not the cops we want to go after. Now, people like Chauvin was a dirtbag, but what he did was manslaughter, you know, and they intimidated the jury and escalated this thing up to murder. So what have you done? You've intimidated more law enforcement officers out of doing their actual job. And so you're going to have a wait and see attitude where they're going to let the thugs do what they do and go in and process the paperwork. That's not law enforcement. That's not law and order. That's not order maintenance. That's not what we need. So we need to repeal these executive and legislative actions that have hamstrung the police and made us all less safe. And that's exactly what I plan to do. Minorities and everyone else need to ask themselves this question. Why don't they want you to have a gun? Why would you trust a government that we've seen execute violence and violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment? I mean, the Fifth Amendment takings clause, they shut down New York City. You know, we had a pandemic, okay, and it killed real people, and it was a real disease, but reasonable minds can differ, but no more than the seasonal flu. And they created a big panic, and they took away people's property. They violated the Fifth Amendment's taking clause without compensation. Now, you know, there was no adjudication. You have unlimited power by unelected officials, and they keep arguing back and forth what's what. Meanwhile, there are real tangible harms happening to people. All right. So when you look at it, and then now they want to call gun violence an epidemic because they think they can get away with the it's a public safety issue argument that they've used for over 100 years to restrict guns in New York City. But it doesn't wash. It's a violation of your Second Amendment rights, just like they violated your Fifth Amendment takings clause. There's no adjudication, no due process of law. You know, when you quarantine somebody, you need to have probable cause that that person is infected and that they need to be quarantined. And there should be an adjudicative process. And then you do so. And then when you want to treat them, you treat them based on informed written consent. They're pushing an experimental vaccine, and I'm glad President Trump pushed it through. But, you know, he's not the scientist that created it, right? You're seeing a lot of side effects. People that have heart issues like myself, it's not good for us. Let individual adults make a choice. So you've seen the way they take freedom when it comes to a declaration of a public health emergency, open-ended with no adjudication whatsoever. And they're telling adults that they're going to make the decision for you and force you to get vaccinated. They do the same thing with guns. They restrict the law-abiding citizens' ability to exercise their Second Amendment right and protect themselves, knowing that the police cannot protect us all, but they do it anyways and they get away with it. So what we need to do is make sure that they respect our constitutional rights. So that's my take on that. So, what you have when you have Democrat corporate machines like this is you have onerous regulations that strangle the lifeblood out of an economy. They create legislation that has no benefit toward the life, safety, and welfare of the citizenry, which the 10th Amendment limits them to. They create regulations well beyond that, and it runs business out. I always love to give the example of the Veterans of Foreign Wars post that put in a hot water heater so they could be more sustainable. They were a little bit out of code, but no life safety issues whatsoever. They find that organization out of existence. And when you do that to business, they pack up their toys and they leave, and they take well-paying jobs with them. So what we need to do is we need to periodically review regulations to see if they're meeting their stated intent or if they're actually harming the economy and eviscerate them. No politician ever does that. No politician ever says, I made a mistake. I want to review this law and tweak it. But that's what we need to do. When it comes to attracting business, what I would do is, instead of placing homeless shelters in the blighted, commercially zoned areas and exposing people to health hazards, we don't know. I mean, these could be Superfund sites with chemicals and deadly diseases, and they just warehouse people in them, or they let people go in there and develop them into housing complexes. I wouldn't do that. Now, in this day and age, there's no excuse for not operating in an environmentally safe way. But you have these blighted commercial areas, and I would invite business in. I would start off with a corporate tax rate of between 5 and a ceiling of 5% and a floor of 1%, and I would negotiate with them. And those that were more friendly to New York City, hiring our local residents, I would make that part of the deal. I would negotiate with them down. Currently, corporate tax in New York City is 8.8%, somewhere around almost 9% of their net income. So after they pay all their bills and stuff, they got to kick in and give in 8% of their income. That's not going to attract business, right? And you have these blighted properties. I wouldn't give them away. I would have the city, through eminent domain, sell them to the corporation at fair market value. That's a win-win for everybody. But they were either going to give it away and they didn't get their sweetheart deals, so they chased Amazon away. That doesn't work. That doesn't help the economy. So you lose well-paying jobs. Our laws should be simple enough for a high school grad to read, understand, and start a business. And in fact, when laws are not that simple, they should be void for vagueness because they're unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional to pass a complicated law. But then again, we look at all these laws and the volume of the paper that's created to create a law is ridiculous. Even at the city and local level, let alone the congressional level, it's ridiculous. No law, no bill should ever be larger than the U.S. Constitution. So you shouldn't have more than 30 pages, let's say. That's a little bit longer than the Constitution. But no bill should be that long. But what they do is they put it in there so that you're confused and you can't abide by the law. So you need a lawyer. I'm not trying to run lawyers out of business, but we shouldn't be doing that. But the bottom line is we have to negotiate a reasonable rate of taxation. And I'm not for raising personal income tax, and I'm not for raising property tax, because that's just going to run people out of business, out of New York. What we need to do is make New York a place where people want to return and start a business and raise a family. And under the current regime, we just can't do that. It's economically unsustainable. I was going to say that goes back to your question about losing congressional seats. People are tired of the nonsense, and you have the graft and corruption. Cuomo has a huge ego, so he names a bridge after his father. But he also takes care of his cronies. We have crony capitalism here, the same way Hitler practiced it, where, the corporatocracy takes care of itself and they all get paid in a circle, and unfortunately we are going to lose a seat, but that it's not going to be AOC in Western Queens with all her radical lunacy. It's most likely going to be
a Republican seat.
A Republican seat out in the western part of the state, because you've had rhinos like Dean Skelos, who went to prison, and I'm glad he did, that, they betrayed us. Astorino could have been our governor, but, thanks to guys like Skelos making deals with Democrats, and you can't make a deal with the socialists because they don't negotiate in good faith. They either stall until they have a more favorable advantage or numeric superiority. And it's the same thing that Mao did with Chiang Kai-shek, and the Democrats in Congress back then and Roosevelt helped them do it. You can't negotiate with them, but you can negotiate fairly with honest corporations, and that's what we need to do. Get rid of the rhinos in the Republican Party and be true to the principles of responsibility and self-reliance, because they work and people know they work and people can tell when they've been had. So, I want a unified Republican Party that stands for those principles of reliance, self-reliance, and responsibility. And that works. And as we demonstrate that, we'll get more and more Democrats, even if they don't change party, to cross over ideologically with us and clean up the corruption. The city is fueled by our tax money going into corrupt practices where these corporations buy into it. And we've got to end that. And the only way to end that is with honesty and integrity and prosecuting people, but showing people that the good old-fashioned work ethic actually does work. And it will work if it's unimpeded. But because you have this corruption where you have some people like Skelos making deals with the Cuomos, people see that. And they're like, these guys are full of it on both ends of the aisle. I don't do that, right? And I want our constituency to know that. With me, you get a square deal, because I'm going to look you in the face every time I see you on the street. And I'm going to tell you, this is what I've done toward what I promised you. I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. As a matter of fact, I'm going to set goals, and we're going to talk to the neighborhood constituency periodically. And you're going to tell me, kind of like Ed Koch used to say, how am I doing? You're going to tell me how I'm doing periodically, because I'm going to want to get reelected, because I'm going to want to see my projects through fruition. All right. So, that's my take on it. But unfortunately, we're going to lose that seat, and it's probably going to be a Republican seat, because too many people have sold us out for the almighty.